Chevron's story is an interesting one. In 1970, you had one individual, Sully Sullivan. You had a medical director who brought the concept of EAP to senior management.
I knew who Sully was before I ever met him. You know, Sully is a kind of a name that you hear, and he's a guy that once you ever meet him, you know, you don't forget him. And when you hear people talk about his story and his involvement, and you know, like it's a wonderful story. I, matter of fact, had the opportunity to not only meet Sully, but also to meet the doctor that was involved.
Sully was the person who really got the EAP off the ground, he and with the support and assistance of Dr. Richman. And in talking with Sully about his experience, he had risen high enough in the company that he was able to really institute a very new idea.
We met about 1967, and Doc had heard about my own alcoholism and my own recovery. I'd been sober about 8 years by then, and he was referring some walk-in alcoholics to me, and I had very little time, no money, no authority, so I don't know what my success rate was, but I didn't even see most of these people again. But we did have one winner I knew of, but he told me at that time, he said, Sully, in my career I've lost 4 doctors to alcoholism. And he said, I know this is a treatable disease, and of course that really hit me.
I was the first one, Chevron, to talk about alcoholism as a disease.
Well, the way we got support in the beginning was mainly through the winners that would go out and sell the program and say, boy, it's just wonderful, because, I mean, we didn't pressure anybody. We said, if someone came to me and said, I don't want to stop drinking, or I want to do this, I said, well, go back to work. And I'd call the supervisor right on the phone and say, put Charlie back to work and base his future with the company on job performance only, not his drinking. Well, yes, sir, okay. This thing started as an alcoholism program, but you see, when you open the door for referrals from and you tell the supervisor not to diagnose. So this is the big point that people miss. Once you get the supervisor to stop diagnosing and they send you work performance problems, you have to take what comes in the door. So you get everything. And that's what confounded this.
In the second year of its operation, what Sully was able to do was expand the scope of EAP to be a broad brush program. He also recognized that his background, while he was able to work very effectively with chemically dependent people, his background didn't have the depth in clinical issues, and so he began hiring professional staff.
Out of our meetings in the PG&E cafeteria came, in that format, became the forerunner for the San Francisco chapter being formed. A lot of the early day programs came out of initiatives that labor were involved with and supported. It became increasingly evident that Almaca needed to evolve to reflect and represent and incorporate the people involved with the profession that really should be called EPA, hence the name. And I just think as more and more initiatives began, and as more and more places had these types of programs, and more employers were adopting these types of programs, it became essential to reflect more accurately what was going on.
The program actually began probably back in the mid-70s when senior management recognized that many valuable employees actually had alcohol problems and needed to have some resource to help them. And so they unofficially created a referral network through one of the personnel departments actually for retirement programs. It was subsequently later on that one of the middle managers, very well respected and well liked in the company, also developed an alcohol problem. And at the time, our head of personnel was talking to the head of personnel for one of the local Bay Area oil companies here in town, Chevron, and was telling them about this really tragic situation with the person having great performance and now having an alcohol problem. And in talking with the head of personnel at Chevron, they said, well, you know, that they had an employee assistance program, and maybe that kind of program could help rehabilitate this employee. So it was thereupon, based upon that discussion, that Wells Fargo actually referred the employee in question to the Chevron EAP program, where they got help and got rehabilitated. And because of the great success of that intervention, Wells Fargo believed that it was essential that they develop their own program.
I came into the public sector. I've been working in public health administration on the outside. And I was asked to come into the bank specifically to start the EAP program there. At the time that I came in, senior management, this was in the early 80s, and senior management had reviewed a lot of the data that was coming out at that time. There was a lot of good research that indicated that a great deal of lost time and reduced performance and sort of dollar items of that sort were due to the fact that employees had unresolved personal problems, and saw a real value in beginning to address those things with a formal program.
The Employee Assistance Program began in 1979 at Levi Strauss & Company by two women by the name of Catherine Sheen and Janet Greenwood. And at that time, I would say it was probably less of a business decision. It was more of this is the right thing to do for our people. It was really consistent with Levi Strauss' philosophy of being respectful and appreciative of employees, and also paying attention to the communities where we did business. So I would say that the origins of EAP really came from this is the right thing to do. And what evolved over time was really that not only is this the right thing to do for our people, but also as a business, it needed to be a good business decision. And that's where we saw the weaving of the EAP out into the business, and eventually the ownership and the paying of the EAP services.
When the program started in '83, it started primarily, like a lot of EAPs, focusing on alcohol and drug problems, substance abuse problems. And within a couple of years, the program expanded to a broad brush program. Over the years, I would say over the last 10 or 12 years, the client base has changed from those people that we originally focused on with substance abuse problems to now anybody in the company who has any type of personal problem that is having an effect on their attendance or their performance at work is invited to use the Employee Assistance Program.
When we were trying to decide how could we best help employees with personal difficulties, one of the things that we recognized was that there wasn't anyone in the organization that really took, if you will, charter for the psychological or emotional problems that come out of a variety of different scenarios in a workplace setting. So, for instance, one of the problems that typically occurs in any kind of financial institution, certainly any kind of company that handles money, is there's always a risk of people being held up or robbed. And back in 1980, we had the unfortunate situation of being asked to intervene and help around a pretty serious bank held up. After that, you know, being in the Bay Area, earthquakes could be always a risk factor, cause a lot of upset. We found that doing debriefings after earthquakes could be something that we might add value.
I think that what we saw was that the business was seeing other ways that they could use us. And through this difficult experience of managing all these plant closures, we developed some pretty close, tight relationships. We'd been through a difficult experience together trying to execute this in a way that was ethical and respectful. And so we had some good relationships built. There was some strong partnerships, and that really laid the foundation for our coming back and talking about a more expanded role in EAP.
We were the first company to have the unfortunate situation of having somebody with HIV disease and somebody who wanted to still remain employed as long as their health would permit. This was back in 1983. There was a lot of unknowns at that time about how this disease was spread, whether or not people would even be willing to work with somebody with that kind of disease. And it was very difficult, I think, for us all because there were no policies, there was no charted waters, if you will. So we were actually the first company in the country to make a determination as how best to proceed. And with the direction of our senior management support, I wrote a policy, worked with the health department, and developed an education program that became one of the model programs within the Bay Area.
In the late 1980s and early 1990s, from the EAP perspective, what we saw, of course, was the advent of managed care. And EAP, we went to our benefits department and said, let's partner to look at this whole issue of managing behavioral health care costs and services for Levi Strauss employees. And so what we did was we decided together that we needed to look at the benefit plan, and that together that we needed to really be looking at vendors for outsourcing behavioral health care services, that our EAP providers no longer could really be providing that direct service, and that they really wanted, the EAP providers needed to move to more of a consultative role. But we needed to be in close relationship with the behavioral health care providers.
In the future, the employee assistance professional is going to have to deal with being a manager of, say, an external EAP vendor and perform that role in a way that is balancing the needs of the company, looking at, say, the legal department, the HR department, the benefits department, and kind of leading the way in terms of what the standard is, standard of care for the employee assistance services.
San Francisco, being on the Pacific Rim, being a very cosmopolitan area, has a very diverse workforce. And because of that diversity, because of the, I think, increasing single parents situations, the increasing, if you will, mobility and people really working from a nuclear family as opposed to extended family, there's been a greater demand for support being placed on the employer and looking for innovative programming to help them deal with all the personal issues that surround the workplace setting.
The philosophy of really taking a business-focused approach was probably first and foremost to be congruent with the overall philosophy of the company, which is to be very customer focused. So one of our key corporate objectives is to understand the needs of the customer and try to surprise and delight them, if you will. So from that perspective, we look not to a program that is driven by our particular protocols, but rather a program that can be very fluid and adaptable based on what the varying needs of the business groups are. As we became known as a 7/24-hour customer service-oriented bank, we certainly couldn't say to our employees, our office hours are 9 to 5. So we've had to be very creative with our scheduling in order to be able to provide a 24-hour service. Now, interestingly, with regard to the kinds of diversity, work-family diversity that you see in a workplace, we've been able to mirror that internally. So, for example, one of our long service employees who wanted to be able to stay home and raise her children is the first person we piloted kind of an evening weekend on call program. That was very successful. We've been able to recruit additional people into that program.
And what we have found is that there is substantial improvement, especially along the criteria of absenteeism, tardiness, roles and responsibilities, peer relations, the supervisor relationship, and the safety record. What we came up with was an interval that showed us that the savings was between $5 and $11 for every single dollar that was invested in EAP.
The head of the claims-paying aspect of the trust did a study as part of his PhD thesis, and what he found is that in the first year following treatment on a broad-based EAP, that there was about a 2-to-1 return on medical surgical expense and sick leave expense based upon what the trust fund was paying. So we were very struck by this as being important research, and I think that type of information needs to be brought down to smaller employers where they can see the value, and in fact I would argue that when you're dealing with a small employer, and you're dealing with some critical person on the staff, a particular individual may be far more impactful on a group of 30 than it is of a group of 3,000.
As president of the International Association, I had the opportunity to see where the association was going, and I see the future as being very bright, especially in the international arena. For example, we've had 2 chapters that's being formed in Johannesburg in South Africa. We have inquiries from Chile. We are doing some things in Australia, and they just recently had an international conference in Australia. The Maoris from New Zealand have become attracted to this association and EAP. And how they gain this attraction is they watched the Native Americans develop a chapter. They developed an EAP that was designed for their casinos. Now they use it for the whole tribe, you know. So how could these visionaries foresee the day when it would be taken to these extremes and produce?
When this thing started, I was in it about 2 months, and I realized this was going to be a huge success. I never once thought of failure. It was just the need was so obvious. There were people hurting, and we knew what to do about it.